popular restaurant and bar owner in Ohio is charged with several felonies, including kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder this week. An arrest warrant was issued for 43-year-old Bobby George. Officials say the alleged heinous crimes were committed between November of 2023 and July of this year. According to an arrest warrant, first reported incident occurred on November 14, 2023, and the details alleged are shocking. The victim told authorities George pinned her to the ground and strangled her while slamming her head against a table. The victim says that caused her to have blurred vision, ringing in her ears, and bleeding from her ears. She told police she was treated by a nurse practitioner who happens to be employed by George and then diagnosed her with post-concussion syndrome. Then, in another incident, George allegedly chased after the victim, who fled a home they shared. He allegedly was holding a gun to the window of the car and forced her to get out of it. When she did get out of the car, George allegedly held the gun to her stomach as he led her back inside the home, according to the warrant. In another incident, the victim says George raped her when she came out of the shower. Fast forward to June of this year, during another altercation, George allegedly refused to let the victim leave their home. He reportedly threw her around and attempted to strangle and suffocate her. George allegedly tried to kill her by shoving a towel down her throat, then asked her, "You think God is going to help you?" after she reportedly hid in a closet and prayed for her life. According to court records, the victim reported the incidents to police on August 9th. The attempted murder charge stems from George allegedly shoving a towel down the woman's throat. And the rape charge stems from the alleged incidents between May and July, when George allegedly threw the victim to the ground and sexually assaulted her while holding her down. After the arrest warrant was issued, George turned himself into police on August 13th. He now faces 9 felony counts: 1 count of rape, 1 count of attempted murder, 4 counts of kidnapping, 1 of assault, and 2 counts of strangulation. According to reports, prosecutors asked for a high bond to be set at $100,000, and a judge doubled that number and set his bond at $200,000. But George only had to post 10% of that. He was released from custody nearly 8 hours after he surrendered to authorities and was ordered to turn in his passport. A protection order is in place for the alleged victim, and if George violates that order, he could face additional charges, as well as a sentence of up to 180 days behind bars. Now, these allegations that Bobby George faces are very serious. We have attempted murder, we have kidnapping, and we have rape. But are you surprised he was issued a $200,000 bond in this case, and he only had to post 10% of that? That was somewhat of a surprise to me. First of all, we're talking about charges that involve the same victim over an almost year-long period of time, and we're talking about a $200,000 bond. Now, what the law is in Ohio is that bonds are supposed to be individually assessed, meaning you're supposed to look at a person's individual financial situation to determine what bond would be appropriate. We know he owned a couple of bars. Were they successful bars? Were they just in-house bars? I'm not sure. But when you see attempted murder, when you see strangulation, when you see rape, it raises some red flashing lights that this should be a high bond. Something that someone has to post all kind of property, not 10%. This should be an all-cash bond, and it should be higher. That's at least what you think about when you hear these kind of charges. And then, according to WKYC, both the prosecutors and George's attorney requested that the bond actually be at $100,000 because he doesn't have a violent criminal history. But again, charges and accusations he faces are incredibly violent. Do you think in some way that the state's recommendation was a little too lenient? Well, it's hard to make that assessment. What in the allegations did the prosecutors or the judge believe perhaps didn't warrant that? Was there a question about the veracity of the allegations? Was there a question about whether or not the victim was going to pursue the case? Was there a question about whether or not they've been communicating and he voluntarily turned himself in, as opposed to taking off on a run for a long period of time before they actually were able to get him into the court? All of those factors would militate in favor of a lower bond if those things were at issue. But there are so many factors that could have been at play to militate. And let's also suggest $200,000 is not a small bond. So it's not a small number, it's just that we're used to seeing much higher numbers when you see an attempted murder charge, or when you see a strangulation which goes along with that domestic violence aspect, or with rape. And through an attorney, George would deny all the allegations against him. So I want to read this quote to you that his attorney told Fox 8 in Ohio. He said, quote, "This did not happen. We deny any and all accusations." And they charged him without even interviewing him or getting his version of events. I also believe that there was an incomplete investigation on this matter. I think it was extremely loose, I think it was unfair, and they never asked for another side of the story. I'm very disappointed. We're talking about things that happen in some time in 2023 until July 2024. Well, were there allegations or were there calls to the police, the first allegation? If not, why the delay? If there were allegations made back then, what was the follow-up? Was a detective assigned to it? And what exactly did the detective do or not do between the time of the first allegation and the second allegation? I mean, certainly as this thing gets vetted out, we'll learn more about why the defense attorney is making those statements. But just in the initial part of it, there's a lot of questions about how this charge came to be, why it was so long between these charges actually being brought. Was there some type of question about the veracity of the charge or the allegations that she made? Was there substance abuse perhaps involved? All of those questions do lend to the question of whether or not the judge believes that a low bond would be appropriate, because ultimately this charge may not go in favor of the state. And again, $200,000 is not a small number. But if you saw an OR bond, meaning an own recognizance, just signed your name and we trust you to come back, it's huge signal. That would be a huge signal that the court does believe that these charges are going to go very far. So $200,000 bond on these types of charges is lower than normal, but it does signal that the court believes that there's some smoke and some fire that needs to be addressed. And going back to the arrest warrant and the details surrounding that, holding a gun to the alleged victim's stomach, shoving a towel down her throat, suffocating her, and those different instances of sexual assault. Based on the arrest warrant and the details, do you think a grand jury will indict Bobby George on these charges? And given that Bobby George was a popular bar owner, he is already out on bond after posting that 10% of that $200,000. He was ordered to turn over his passport, and a temporary restraining order is in place for the alleged victim. But kind of going back to the victim's perspective in this case, what kind of message do you believe that sends to her where, her alleged perpetrator is out on bond right now, given these really horrific details and accusations that he now faces? Well, that's an interesting line to cross, or a line to walk. So as the state, as the prosecutor, as the system, there has to be a presumption that every individual is innocent unless and until proven guilty, and that is an absolute requirement for a fair system. That has to be what is advocated for and established. But on the other hand, if a person is the victim of a violent crime, they have to be protected, and they have to feel that the system is protecting them through that process. So if the victim, and there are victim advocates, and certainly Marcy's law that we have in Ohio, requires certain notice requirements and certain protections for the victim that did not previously exist before 2018. Those items are in place so that the victim would feel more secure about the process as it goes forward. But you have to believe, when individuals have been the victims of vicious assaults and sexual assaults, that there is a psychological impact of knowing, number one, that this thing happened to them, and second of all, that the person that perpetrated these heinous acts on them are able to walk around freely and potentially endanger their lives or the lives of others. As for where the case goes next, it will be presented to a grand jury in the next few weeks, and they'll decide if George should be indicted on the charges.